Call Grant Robertson.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr Chair, and I'll certainly endeavour to do that because, as you say, Clause 3 does amend the Employment Relations Act 2000, and I think what we can do in this debate at this point is assess whether this is the appropriate act to be amending and what that act does and whether this amendment is appropriate in terms of the Employment Relations Act. And, Mr Chair, I would refer the House to the objects of the Employment Relations Act 2000. In particular, the object of this Act is A, to build productive employment relationships through the promotion of good faith in all aspects of the employment environment and of the employment relationship. Yes, I will say that again. The object of the Employment Relations Act, which is Clause 3 that we're discussing here, is to build productive employment relationships through the promotion of good faith in all aspects of the employment environment and of the employment relationship. The question I ask, Mr Chair, is whether this amendment bill supports those objects. Whether a bill that says no matter what happens in the employment relationship, no matter how it might change over time, it locks the people in place as they were when they signed the contract. Does that support, well, that's, Mrs Wagner, that's what this bill does, because it says, despite what might have been decided in 2005, that whatever happens when it's signed, that locks in the relationship. Now, when we look at the Bryson decision, the main element to arise from the Bryson decision was that the nature of the employment relationship depends on what the parties intend and agree, but also on what they do and how they conduct themselves. And this amendment bill is saying that the second part of that, on what parties do and how they conduct themselves, is no longer a relevant consideration. That the Employment Relations Act is now limited to such a point that there is now no ability to take into account how the relationship evolves over time. There's also now no ability to go to court to even test whether or not the relationship has changed in such a way that it is no longer appropriate to consider an employee a contractor or consider someone a contractor or an employee. So we're looking at Clause 3, Mr Chair, and Clause 3 is whether the fact that this Act amends the Employment Relations Act, and it's important to look at the objects of the Employment Relations Act and how this bill supports or does not support those objects. And in my opinion, Mr Chair, the kind of change that the government is proposing here is actually against the idea of good faith, because it's saying that no matter what actually happens in an employment relationship, if good faith is not progressed, if things change in the employment relationship, it's locked down as to how it was signed on day one. And Mr Bryson's case shows us that employment relationships can change. Yeah. Someone can be taken on as a contractor, but then in effect become an employee by the nature of ongoing work continually within the same organisation doing a similar piece of work. And eventually both parties might consider that person to be an employee. But under this bill, they can't do that. They cannot do that. They can't take it to court to test it. They can't change it. It's locked in, locked down. And my view is, as we look at Clause 3 that amends the Act, the Employment Relations Act, that the objects of this Act are no longer being fulfilled by this amendment. If we go on to the second part of the objects of the Employment Relations Act, it says that the object of this Act is to build that productive relationship by recognising that employment relationships must be built not only on the implied mutual obligations of trust and confidence, but also on a legislative requirement for good faith behaviour. Trust and confidence, Mr Chair, good faith. Key objects of the Employment Relations Act, which is mentioned here in Clause 3, being broken by this amendment. How can trust and confidence be there if it's actually impossible for somebody to relook at the nature of their employment relationship? How can it possibly improve trust and confidence, the objects of the Employment Relations Act, if someone can no longer go to court to assess whether they think that relationship has changed? The law in this area is settled. There is no need for so-called clarity. Movies have been made in New Zealand since 2005. Major, big-budget production films operating perfectly well in settled law. And there is no need to undo the Employment Relations Act, Clause 3 of this bill, wants to amend the Employment Relations Act. The Employment Relations Act itself has in its objects clear things. Mr Chair.
Order. I'm on my feet. Look, I've been listening to this debate on television before I came here, and I'm mindful of the ruling that the Chair, whom I relieved, made in quoting Marion Hobbs, Speaker's ruling 108/5. And this is not a debate about the objects, as the member has just been related. It is specifically about that this Act amends the Employment Relations Act. It's about amending. And we shall keep a tighter rein on subject material in relation to the Sue Moroney. A point of order, Trevor Mallard, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Chairman, I'm sorry, I was out of the House and wasn't, and I'm not sure if we're allowed to refer to watching on television. I think that's people outside, but I won't refer to watching on television. Mr Chairman, the question I had is whether it is in order to discuss, seeing as we are proposing an amendment, because it goes to whether or not the opposition might support this clause. Clearly we won't support the bill. Whether, if we are amending the Employment Relations Act, whether other parts can be added, which are obviously related and within the general scope of the bill, in order, while that, if you like, as the train is going through, whether additional carriages can be added to it. And I'd like your ruling, sir, to say that whether because this is, I think we can accept that there can't be general, totally unrelated amendments to the Employment Relations Act, but whether it's a question of how far the Act is opened up by this clause if in fact we supported it. Because, sir, if, some of us would like to make some other changes as well, and we might well be supportive if in fact that was the case.
I think I just am going to now read 108/5. Members must focus on the wording of the bill, on the intention of this bill, and not focus on alternatives that are not part of the bill. And I think that answers the member's question. Sue Moroney.